We've all heard about Black history in the United States, but how much do you know about Black history in Canada? What up everyone, CharisMaggie here and welcome back to my channel where I encourage you to submerge yourself in culture and live meaningful lives. Y'all, it is Black History Month and I wanted to, take some time to talk about Black history, but not just Black history on a whole, specifically focusing on it in Canada because there's a lot of history that a lot of people don't know. I've recently been reading about it a lot, and I wanted to share this information because I think it would really clear some things up for some people when they think that, Canada didn't have, enslavement or a history of that. That is completely false. They also had it. And so I hope through this video, you'll be able to learn something new. It was a bit of information overload for me, I'll be honest, but I hope that I can do my best in summarizing the information that I was able to find out. So let's get into it. So starting at the very beginning of when enslavement was recorded, it was in this area called New France. Now, New France was a region that was made up of Quebec, Acadia, and Louisiana territories. And it was also known as the very first French settlement in North America. The enslavement of African folks in Canada goes back as early as the 1600s. However, the first people who were enslaved were Indigenous people with a large population from the Pawnee Nation, which is located in present-day Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So while Indigenous folks were enslaved, they slowly began enslaving African folks as well through private sales. So just like everywhere else, they were looking to have free labor to help to build up their empires. So all of these great empires that we see today, yes, they were on the back of free labor. So for about 200 years, Indigenous folks and African folks were enslaved by Europeans. They were used, abused, and also passed down, inherited, and treated as property. Now, the earliest written evidence of an enslaved African sale happened in 1629, and it was of a boy who was at least 6 years old. They say he was either from Madagascar or Guinea, and he was sold by two British brothers, the Kirk brothers, to a French clerk who was named Oliver Le Bailiff. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Now, this same boy, he was passed down, sold to other people, and ironically enough, he was then later baptized and renamed Oliver. I think it was Oliver Lejeune or something like that. The irony, right? At the peak of enslavement in New France, there were about 4,200 enslaved folks, with 2,700 of them being indigenous and about 1,443 who were enslaved African folks. So as the year went on, there was a growing demand for enslaved Africans to be used as free labor because enslavers didn't want to pay European workers to do any work. This is pretty much how they went about growing their empire, being so filthy rich at the end of the day. If you don't pay people for their work, money isn't coming out of your pocket. Sounds familiar? But anyways, I digress. The French eventually received permission from the king at the time, so that was King Louis XIV, for them to import Africans, and this happened in 1689. Now fast forward to April 13th, 1709, a law was put in place to officially legalize the act of enslavement in New France, and this allowed them to enslave indigenous folks and African folks. So in between, there are a lot of stuff that happened, wars and stuff like that between European nations. And so fast forward to when the British got to take control over this French colony of New France. So the colony of New France was surrendered to the British in 1760, and it officially became a British colony through the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Now, through this trade, there was an agreement made between the British and French settlers that they would have permission to hold on to the persons that they enslaved and use them however they saw fit. And this was made through a clause called the Articles of Capitulation. So basically, even though the British were now taking over this colony, the French who decided to stay, they had permission to hold on to their slaves who they considered to be their possession. Go figure, right? As it became a British colony, New France was then renamed to the province of Quebec. Stay with me now. So that is enslavement in New France. Now let's talk about enslavement in British North America. So this is when the British has now taken over, them are run things now. So the colonies of British North America, they were made up of the following. So you had the province of Quebec, which later on you're going to find out was named Upper Canada and Lower Canada. So Upper Canada is known as present-day Ontario. Lower Canada is known as present-day Quebec. Nova Scotia, St. John's Island, which was later named Prince Edward's Island, and Newfoundland, and also the Hudson Bay Company territories. So let's talk about St. John's Island for a minute. So St. John's Island was renamed to Prince Edward Island in 1799. And at the time, it was the only jurisdiction in British North America that had a regulation in place on enslaved people. This regulation pretty much stated that them being baptized doesn't prevent them from being enslaved. So it doesn't matter if they were baptized. The only way that they could get out of enslavement is if their owners gave them permission to be free. Now, in order to encourage white settlers to relocate to the island of Prince Edward Island, there was an act of parliament that was put in place to offer 40 shillings for every black person that they brought into the island. 40 shillings? They would pay them 40 shillings for every enslaved black person or African that they brought into the island. Let that sink in for a minute. Now, a significant event known as the American Revolutionary War, which was from 1773 to 1783, happened, and the British was defeated in this. Because of this defeat, the number of enslaved Africans in British North America increased significantly, and this is why. To encourage white American settlers to immigrate to British North America, the government passed the Imperial Statute of 1790, which allowed them to come over with their enslaved folks, their house and land, like furniture, all of these things, duty-free. The only stipulation, however, was that the enslaved folks that they gained through chattel slavery, they were not allowed to be sold for a year after they have moved into the colony. By the 1790s, they estimated that about 1,200 to 2,000 enslaved Africans were living in the Maritimes. So Maritimes incorporated Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. Whereas in Lower Canada, known as Quebec, there were about 300 enslaved folks. Whereas in Upper Canada, known as Ontario, there were about 700 enslaved folks. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Black Loyalists before of Nova Scotia. And essentially what happened was during the American Revolutionary War, you had freed as well as enslaved African folks who signed up to fight for the British because they had promised them that they would get their freedom and also land. And so when this fight was finished, they were located to Nova Scotia. And when they moved there, they realized that this promise was pretty much a scam because there was no land for them. They were not welcome. Discrimination is all that they faced and bad treatment, all of that. And that is why there is such a deep-rooted history when we talk about Nova Scotia and racism, for example, and discrimination. It has this history already. So when they moved to Nova Scotia, they were already battling with, other white loyalists who were probably living there to get work and job opportunities and even land. They had to get the scraps because they were initially lied to of what they would be provided. So when it comes down to slave ownership in Canada, what is interesting to know is that almost everyone had slaves or enslaved people. Here is a little list for you. You had military officials, disbanded soldiers, loyalists. Remember when I talked about the white loyalists who were given, land and they were told that they could come over here with their enslaved people, them, merchants, fur traders, hotel keepers, tradesmen, bishops, priests, even nuns, okay? So almost every single one of them participated in some way, shape, or form in chattel slavery, which is why it took them quite a bit of time to abolish slavery because a lot of them were also directly involved with owning slaves. So apart from having enslaved people for free labor, apparently having slaves also showed your degree of wealth as well. And so a lot of people would have maybe one or two, to some having 20, to some having even more. So yes, some of the people who are involved, side-eyeing your ancestors. And another thing too is that before slavery was abolished, they were allowed to pass down enslaved people in wills. And so you had people who were like inheriting enslaved people. So daddy died and you now inherited enslaved people. Can you imagine? They had these people passed down like they treated them like property. That's pretty much what chattel slavery was all about. But isn't that interesting? Now, when we talk about resistance, now, one thing in common with our African ancestors is that they resisted in any way they could. And some of it was very creative, some of it was very passive aggressive. Like they did not play when it came on to resisting. So some of the ways they resisted was like leaving their owners, place for a short period of time and then coming back. So leaving without permission and then just coming back when they felt like. Some other ways was pretty much pretending to be sick or physically ill or physically injured so that they didn't have to work. I know some of you probably heard about, like, spitting in their slave owners' food. These are different ways that they rebel. Sometimes they even went as far as to just running away and seeking their freedom because they realized that no one was going to give them their freedom except for themselves. But another way that some of them were also able to resist slavery or enslavement was that they would challenge the status of their slave status. That would be bringing their owners to court for them to, like, prove that you actually own me. Like, show me the receipts. Where are the receipts to show me that you're my owner? And some of them actually won because there were cases that this kind of evidence could not be shown. And so they gained their freedom. So it was interesting. Like, they were very smart people. I don't know why a lot of people think that enslaved folks were like these uneducated people. Like, these were intelligent people who were taken away from their lands and forced to do free labor to build up everything that we're pretty much enjoying today. Like, it's unreal. Let's talk about the abolition of slavery in Canada. So remember earlier when I mentioned that it took a while for them to abolish slavery because so many people, even everyday people, were enslavers themselves. So I'm talking people in the military, parliament, even the church. Okay, and so there was one incident that happened that was pretty much the catalyst for them moving towards eventually abolishing slavery. And this incident happened with an enslaved woman by the name of Chloe Cooley. So her enslaver was by the name of Sergeant Alan Vrooman. And she always resisted. So all the ways that I mentioned that, enslaved folks used to rebel, she did all of them. And so there was one particular day, this was on March 14th, 1793, where she was violently, forcefully sold. And what happened was that he pretty much tied her up with a rope, bounded her, put her in a boat, and he was on his way to sell her to someone in New York. And she was screaming on the top of her lungs. There was this free black man by the name of Peter who saw what was happening, and there were other witnesses as well. And so they reported the incident to Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe at the time, as well as the other executive council members. And they were trying to pretty much plead a case of why we need to get rid of slavery. And so what happened was Vrooman, that's Chloe's enslaver, he was actually charged, but because he was able to plead his case in court to show that he is her owner and he could do whatever he wants with his possession, as there was no law in place to prevent him from doing as he pleased with his possession, the charges were pretty much dropped. So with all of this happening, it said that Simcoe actually worked towards an abolition bill. However, he received opposition for reasons that I mentioned before. And so instead, they came to some kind of compromise and they amended the bill to introduce instead the Act of Limited Slavery in Upper Canada. And this was implemented July of 1793. So this act was pretty much to prevent the further importation of African enslaved people into Upper Canada, and also for the children of enslaved women to be free by the time they were 25 years old. However, it did not actually prevent slavery from continuing because they could still trade, enslaved people within the province and also across the border to the United States. It's just that they weren't able to import new African enslaved people. But of course, because of the terms of the Act of Limited Slavery, it also meant that if people are not going to be able to import new enslaved people, then that means that their supply would also be decreased at a certain amount of time. And also, because it allowed for children of enslaved women to be free by the time they are 25, that also put a cap as to how long they can have people enslaved for. And so eventually this is what led to slavery being abolished after a while. And so it was in 1834 that slavery got abolished in Canada. The last recorded sale in Upper Canada was March 1824, and it was for a 15-year-old boy by the name of Tom. Now let's talk about the Underground Railroad and its significance to Canada. Now the Underground Railroad was a secret organization, and it was made up of people who were helping African Americans, especially from the South, to seek refuge and freedom, because At the time, slavery was not fully abolished in all of the United States. The South was still very much going under enslavement. So slavery wasn't fully abolished in the United States until 1865. And remember, in Canada, it was abolished from 1834. So one thing to note is that the Underground Railroad wasn't actually a railroad. It was more of a secret organization, as I mentioned before, because it was made up of different people who were initially just against enslavement. They did not like the concept of it, and they wanted to help to liberate people. And so the reason they have the term Underground Railroad is because they use terms that were associated to a railroad. So, for example, a conductor is someone who would basically lead the pathway for helping an enslaved person reach freedom in the North. You had cargo, which was referred to an enslaved person who was being transported. The word stations was used to describe safe houses, which was refuge for those who ran away from slavery. And then you have terms like ticket agent, which was the person who actually planned the route for the escape. So it was pretty interesting how they went about doing it, and they got it accomplished and helped to liberate so many people. And the routes taken by the runaway slaves were called lines. And so everything made sense. It came together to make this system that worked for everyone involved. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of like Harriet Tubman, for example, how she played an integral role in helping to liberate a lot of slaves via the Underground Railroad. And so in the 1800s, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 African Americans escaped to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And to end off this video, let's look at how Black history got recognized here in Canada, because even though we did abolish slavery first, United States actually had Black history recognized in their country first, with Canada coming a little bit afterwards. So check out this video that I made on my Instagram and TikTok. We've heard about Black history in the US, but have you ever wondered how Black History Month got recognized in Canada? It all started with the formation of the Ontario Black History Society in 1978. It was formed to address the absence of educational and historical material about Black Canadians. Some of its founders, including Dr. Daniel Hill and Wilson Brooks, introduced a petition to the City of Toronto to have February proclaimed as Black History Month. And in 1979, Toronto was the first to recognize February as Black History Month. In 1988, Nova Scotia recognized its first Black History Month, and in 1996, it was renamed to African Heritage Month. Now, fast forward to 1993, the Ontario Black History Society filed a petition for Black History Month to be recognized in Ontario. After the success of that motion, the president of the Ontario Black History Society, Rosemary Sadler, introduced the idea of having Black History Month recognized in all of Canada to Dr. Jean Augustine. Finally, in 1995, Dr. Jean Augustine, who was the first Black Canadian woman to be elected into Parliament, filed a motion to have February recognized as Black History Month in all of Canada. The House of Commons carried this motion unanimously, and now every year we celebrate Black History Month in February here in Canada. Well, y'all, that's the end for this video. I really hope that you learned something new and that the information wasn't too overloaded. I really tried my best to give you a brief summary, and trust me, this is not everything. There was so much more that I could talk about, maybe even talking about the contribution of Black Canadians here. However, maybe I'll have to leave that for another time, but this is definitely a start. So hopefully this will make you curious. All of the information that I was able to receive, I have to credit it to the Canadian Encyclopedia website, because I could not have made sense of everything without the help of the resource there. So if you want to learn more, I'm going to put links in the description box so that you can have some fun reading on your own. I did a Black History Month playlist. I did a Black History playlist a couple years ago that I think you would like if you want to learn about Black music, Black food, Black inventors, activists, etc. Check out this playlist right here. Super fun. See you in the next one. Bye.